Right. Welcome everybody to our last session, session 13, coming from Ezekiel 37. Working title here, Ezekiel and John, Prophecy and Fulfillment. So what I'm trying to do here is basically create something of an overlay between both Ezekiel and John as kind of a way of explaining how John is a little different from the other Gospels. Now you might be thinking, well, why are we even talking about John? We're not in the New Testament yet, and we won't be for some time. We still have a whole another quarter to go. This is true. But one of the reasons why I'm making it a point to do this is because it will save us some time when we get into the Gospel of John, because probably we're only going to have about 4 or 5 Sundays in that whole Gospel, if that. And there'll be hand selected stories, of course, that we might not really be able to use in a way that will help us to reach back to this now. And because of what the context of Ezekiel 37 actually has to say with respect to this, I think it will be helpful for us to use this as a way of appreciating the fulfillment of this in the future and what it's really speaking to. Okay. So I'm going to try to be somewhat brief about this so that way we can unpack it more in the future. So here we have Ezekiel's scroll and John's gospel on either side of the screen, and a few other passages to help us kind of see how John progresses with these thoughts, either in that gospel in another place, just to add another thought to it, or later on in the book of Revelation, because of course he's accredited with that work as well. So here in Ezekiel 1, this is interesting because we have the appearance of the brilliant light all around, that was like that of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day. This was the appearance of the glory, likeness of God's glory. I forgot to mention, obviously, this is Ezekiel finding himself on the banks of the Kabar River. He's exiled now. He is a priest who's supposed to be serving in the temple, but he can't because that temple is now under siege and will soon be destroyed. And of course, he will not see it again in his lifetime. That being said, that as the Lord approaches him on his portable throne, held up by these cherubim who are moving it toward Ezekiel, this is what he describes it as. And he says, this was the appearance of the likeness of the Lord's glory. Now, it's interesting how, with respect to John, when he opens up his gospel, he gives us this doxology that's very different from the other gospels. And he speaks in verse 14 about how the word become flesh, dwelt among us, and we observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son from the Father. So when he speaks like this is indeed the same kind of concept that Ezekiel was using here. So both of them opening up their scroll and gospel with the same concept. And John doubles down on this when in Revelation chapter 1, he speaks of the same thing when he describes the appearance of the Son of Man using very similar terms to what Daniel used when he was describing this heavenly being that he was conversing with in his particular scroll, and also the Ancient of Days and the one like the Son of Man in Daniel 7. Back to Ezekiel now, moving on to chapter 8. So here we have the Spirit bringing him to the inner court of the Lord's house, and they were bowing to the east in worship of the sun. So he's seeing people there practicing these occultic rituals, and as he just said, bowing in the direction of the east in worship of the sun. This again is in Yahweh's house of all places. So the temple itself being completely defiled, which brings us through Ezekiel chapter 9. We got a misprint here. I've got to fix that. But anyway, in Ezekiel 9, that should be chapter 10 in the next block. Here's what the prophet says. He spoke to the others in my hearing, pass through the city after them and start killing, begin at my sanctuary. So the debauchery that he sees in chapter 8 is now being um, judged and brought to an end with respect to what these divine, unseen by the eyes of man other than Ezekiel beings are supposed to be doing after they've marked the ones who are not doing the right thing and ultimately are going to be judged because of it. Excuse me. And then after this, in chapter 10, the glory of the Lord moved away from the threshold of the temple and it stopped above the cherubim. So the condemnable practices, the pronouncement of condemnation, and the departure of the glory of the Lord. Well, what's interesting is the way that John modularizes his gospel, and he takes an event that happens in the Passion Week narrative that is placed there by all the other gospel writers, an event that happens immediately after Jesus comes into the city after the triumphal entry moment, and he moves that to the beginning of his gospel, years before it actually happens. Some have stylized this as a first cleansing, and the other one that happens in the Passion Week is a second cleansing. But others, and myself included, seem to believe this is just John's way of kind of transitioning this away from that. And so when John puts this there, some have suggested the reason is because, again, he is patterning his progression through the gospel narrative of Jesus's life in the same way that the Ezekiel scroll is stylized, in such a way that he is showing Jesus as the very God that Ezekiel is speaking about, as visiting himself amongst his people here. But as he goes into the temple, what he finds is these depraved practices of turning this house of prayer for all nations into a den of thieves through the selling of oxen, sheep, and doves. And then he overthrows the money changers. And then he tells them to get these things out of here because of the fact he's defiled his father's house, turning it into a marketplace. And because of his pronouncement of the condemnation here, he tells them um, that this place is ultimately going to be destroyed, right? He pronounces that even though he speaks of the destruction of his body, it's nonetheless a condemnation of the temple that it too itself will be pulled down, which in the other gospels, we see the very following up of that edict with eventually his disciples asking him about when these things will occur. And Jesus says, it will happen before that generation passes away, right? And then we end John chapter 2 with the understanding that Jesus does not allow himself to be entrusted to people. He leaves the temple behind, right? And he will not come again into it until the next following Passover. So eventually, he does depart from the temple completely when he is run out of the temple later on in John chapter 10. But before we get there, when Ezekiel 11 comes, we have the glory of the Lord rising up from the city and stopping on the mountain east of the city. Notice that it goes from Jerusalem to the mountain directly east of the city, the Mount of Olives, which some have made the case that that perhaps is the very place where Jesus was crucified, because when we move over to John 10, when we see that Jesus is run out of the temple because the Jews picked up rocks to stone him, and then after that he escapes their grasp. So here he leaves the temple until eventually he is tried and condemned. And as he's tried and condemned, starting out first close to the temple in the high priest's palace, then in the Antonia Philippus that's part of the Temple Mount by Pilate, carried out of the city to be crucified, and then ultimately the glory has departed at that point. So, point being is that this seems to be a reference here in some loose way to what will happen in real space and time. So, hence the reason for my reference in John 19 for Jesus being carried out and crucified there. Now back to Ezekiel 37, part of our actual text. So it helps us in the progression of all this to see that when Ezekiel prophesies, the sticks that you have written on in your hand are in full view of the people. Tell them that he is going to take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone and gather them from all around and bring them into their own land, regathering one stick Israel, the other stick Judah, reforming them into one particular people, right? In some ways, I think this perhaps is similar to the very prayer of unification that Jesus is having or giving in John 17 when he is asking, praying to the Father that all those people that will hear the message of what's happened here, that they will all be one. And many times we have a tendency to hyper individualize this to our own context and time, because this is when we are experiencing that. But this also starts with the very message that's proclaimed by these apostles for several years that is exclusively to just Jews. And of course, the first believers who followed Jesus after the disciples, because of the teaching and preaching of the disciples, are exclusively Jewish, with the exception of Cornelius. But then again, that's sometime after the initial efforts that happened with Pentecost. So all that to simply say there is an ingathering here of first ethnic Israel, but then with the Gentiles that come along too, they become part of the larger, expanded, renewed Israel, such that what John would say in Revelation 7, that he heard about the numbering of the 144,000, but when he turned to see what the fulfillment of this actually was, it was people from every nation, tribe, and tongue that no one could possibly number. Back to Ezekiel 37, he said to me, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, son of man, saying to it, this is what the Lord God says. Breath, come from the four winds, breathe into those who were slain. So I prophesied, the breath entered them. This is the Ruach, the very agent of creation that is working with Yahweh as an extension of Yahweh, because he is Yahweh in Genesis chapter 1. Enters them, they stood, and they became a vast army. John 2 is also making this reference when he is describing in chapter 20 of his gospel an event that doesn't take place in the other gospels, that Jesus appears to them, says, peace be with them, gives them the commission, or his version of it, as my Father has sent me, I'm sending you. Then he breathes on them and tells them to receive the Holy Spirit, and then gives them a priestly commission that for the sins of those who are, or for those whose sins are remitted in heaven, then their sins will be remitted on earth. That's the proper understanding of the Greek rendering of these words, rather than just the English translations of them. That being said, this priestly work also, doubling back, mimics what is following up here in Ezekiel, because after 38, 39, the war of Gog and Magog, then we get into chapters 40 through 48, which is a breakdown of a redistribution of the land and the building of the temple. More importantly, the building of the temple, which when you get to Ezekiel 47, overlays with the description of the city itself coming out of heaven in Revelation chapter 20. So that being said, more pattern development between the books of John and Ezekiel, but this is a description of the people of God, not an actual physical place. But we'll get to more of that when we actually study this together. So hopefully that's helpful. And I appreciate you listening, tuning in for all these lessons. I hope on some level this is really helping you as much as it's helping me. So anyway, we'll talk again soon.